Just 3 minutes ago, the unthinkable happened. Without warning, without consultation, and without mercy, Prince William executed a royal power move so unprecedented, it sent shockwaves through Buckingham Palace. A decree. Immediate. Irreversible. Camilla's entire family stripped of royal privileges in a single stroke. No ceremony, no explanation. Just silence, followed by chaos. But what could possibly drive the future king to make such a ruthless and sudden decision? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The moment did not unfold with hesitation. It struck with precision, almost as if it had been rehearsed in secrecy for weeks, perhaps even months. One command, quietly delivered yet thunderous in consequence, moved through the palace like an unseen force, dismantling years of carefully constructed influence in seconds. Titles vanished. Access was revoked. Doors that had always been open suddenly closed without warning, without appeal, without negotiation. Those closest to the corridors of power felt at first the shift, the silence, the sudden absence of authority where it once existed without question. Royal aides, usually composed and controlled, found themselves scrambling, their voices lowered but urgent, their expressions betraying a confusion they could not contain. It wasn't just the decision that stunned them, it was the way it happened. No build-up, no visible conflict, just an outcome so final that it left no room for resistance. And yet, what made the moment even more unsettling was not what was seen, but what was missing. King Charles absent, not present at the center of the storm, not publicly aligned, not even quietly acknowledged. His silence created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, William's authority expanded with startling clarity. It felt less like a decision and more like a declaration, one that redefined who truly held control in that moment. Senior insiders, those who prided themselves on knowing every shift before it occurred, were left blindsided, their confidence shaken by the realization that this had been orchestrated beyond their reach. And as the news rippled outward, the emotional impact struck hardest within Camilla's inner circle. Shock turned into disbelief, disbelief into quiet panic. The ground beneath them had shifted, and no one could explain how or why it had happened so suddenly. But beneath the chaos, beneath the confusion, there was something else, something colder, more deliberate. This did not feel impulsive. It felt calculated, planned, as if every move had been mapped out long before the first whisper of it reached the palace halls. And that realization, more than anything else, began to raise a far more dangerous question, not just what William had done, but why he had been preparing to do it all along. But behind this shocking decree lies a deeper story, one buried in years of quiet tension, silent rivalries, and a growing fracture that the palace could no longer contain. This wasn't just a decision, it was the climax of a war that had been brewing behind palace walls for years. Smiles in public, tension in private. Beneath the polished surface of royal unity, a silent conflict had been escalating, one that pitted loyalty against legacy, tradition against influence. And at the center of it all, Camilla's family, and a future king who had been watching everything unfold. Long before the decree shattered the illusion of calm, there had been whispers, quiet at first, almost dismissible, but persistent enough to unsettle those who paid close attention. It began with subtle discomfort, an unspoken awareness that something within the royal structure was shifting in ways that did not feel entirely natural. Camilla's family, once seen as peripheral, began occupying spaces that carried more weight than tradition would typically allow. And while no rule was openly broken, the boundaries themselves started to blur. That was where the unease took root. For William, this was never about personal dislike, it was about something far more complex. Something tied to the very survival of the institution he had been raised to protect. He observed carefully, silently, as influence seemed to stretch beyond ceremonial expectation into areas that carried quiet authority. Conversations that should have remained internal began to feel exposed. Decisions that once followed a clear hierarchy started to carry unfamiliar fingerprints. And while none of it was loud enough to spark immediate confrontation, it was enough to create a fracture, small, but widening with time. Inside the palace, loyalties became less certain. Staff members who had served the crown with unwavering neutrality found themselves subtly pulled in different directions. their silence masking a growing tension they could neither express nor ignore. Some aligned with tradition, believing the monarchy must remain untouched by external influence. Others adapted, accepting the evolving dynamics as inevitable. But beneath it all, a quiet division settled in, invisible to the public yet impossible to escape within those walls. William felt it more than anyone. Every public appearance, every carefully measured interaction carried an undercurrent that only he seemed fully aware of. Moments of unity were performed flawlessly, yet behind them lingered conversations left unfinished, disagreements left unresolved. There were instances brief, almost imperceptible, where tension surfaced just enough to be noticed, then quickly buried beneath protocol. But those moments mattered. They revealed a truth that could no longer be ignored. This was not harmony. It was restraint. And as the months passed, that restraint began to wear thin. William's concern deepened, not out of fear but out of clarity. He began to see the bigger picture, the long-term impact, the slow erosion of structure, the risk of allowing influence to grow unchecked. This was no longer about isolated incidents. It was about a pattern, a direction, a future that felt increasingly uncertain if left unchallenged. What made it even more dangerous was how quietly it all unfolded. There was no single event to point to, no defining moment to justify alarm. Just a steady accumulation of small shifts, each one seemingly insignificant on its own, yet together forming something undeniable, something inevitable. And deep down, William knew this could not continue forever, that sooner or later, something would break. Because tensions like this do not simply disappear. They build. They wait, and when the right moment comes, they erupt not gradually, but all at once, with a force that leaves no room for compromise. And while the tension simmered quietly for years, one specific moment would ignite everything, forcing William's hand in a way no one could have predicted. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't speculation. It was an incident, one so explosive, so deeply unsettling, that it shattered whatever fragile balance remained inside the monarchy. Details remain tightly guarded, but what is known paints a picture of betrayal, overstep, and a line crossed beyond repair. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. What began as a quiet alert, something initially dismissed as routine concern, quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. Information surfaced fragmented at first, then disturbingly clear, pointing toward actions that should never have happened, connections that should never have been made, and influence that had reached far beyond what anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just inappropriate. It was destabilizing. At the center of it all were figures tied directly to Camilla's family, individuals who had gradually moved closer to the heart of royal operations, without ever officially stepping into positions of power. That ambiguity had always been their shield. But now, it became the very thing that raised suspicion. Allegations began to form, not publicly, not yet but internally, where the stakes were far higher. The suggestion that royal association had been used not as a symbol of duty, but as a tool of access, of leverage, of quiet advantage. And once that possibility was acknowledged, everything changed. Emergency discussions were called with an urgency that could not be hidden, even behind closed doors. Senior figures gathered, voices measured but tense, each aware that what they were confronting could not simply be dismissed or quietly managed. There was no precedent for this, no protocol that could neatly resolve what was unfolding. The deeper they looked, the more unsettling it became. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a breach, one that threatened not just reputation, but trust itself. And then came the moment that altered everything. The evidence reached William, not as rumor, not as interpretation, but as something concrete, something undeniable. The kind of information that does not invite debate, only decision. For a brief moment there was silence. Not outwardly, but within him. Because what he had in front of him was not just a situation to manage. It was a line that had been crossed in a way that made inaction impossible. This was where it became personal. Not because of anger, but because of responsibility. William had spent years preparing to uphold something larger than himself. Something built on perception, on trust, on the belief that the institution stood above individual gain. And now, That belief felt threatened from within. The weight of it pressed heavily, forcing him to confront a reality he had long feared but never fully faced, that sometimes protecting the monarchy meant confronting those connected to it. Around him, opinions fractured. Some advisors urged caution, warning of the consequences, the fallout, the risk of turning a controlled issue into a public storm. Others pushed for decisive action, arguing that hesitation would only deepen the damage. But what made the moment so volatile was that there was no safe option. Every path carried risk. Every decision would leave a mark. And in that uncertainty, one truth became impossible to ignore. Silence was no longer protection. It was complicity. The longer this remained hidden, the greater the cost would become, not just internally, but in the eyes of a world that expected integrity from those who represented the crown. William understood that delay was no longer an option, that whatever came next would have to be swift, undeniable, and impossible to reverse. Because once a line like this is crossed, it doesn't fade. It demands response. It demands consequence. And most of all, it demands a choice, one that cannot be undone once made. But this wasn't just about protocol or power, it was about something far more personal. Something that cut deep into William's sense of duty and identity. Behind the authority, behind the title, stood a man torn in two. Prince William wasn't just making a royal decision, he was confronting a deeply personal dilemma: protect the monarchy, or preserve fragile family ties. One path demanded strength. The other demanded silence. And as the weight of the crown loomed closer than ever, William faced a choice that would define his legacy forever. The information he had received did not just challenge protocol, it challenged his sense of identity, the very principles he had been raised to embody. For years, he had walked a careful line, balancing respect with restraint, choosing patience over confrontation, believing that stability could be preserved without force. But now, that belief felt dangerously close to illusion. What made this moment so heavy was not just the scale of the issue, but its proximity. This was not a distant threat. It was embedded within the family structure itself, woven into relationships that were already complex, already delicate. To act meant disruption. To remain silent meant compromise. And in that quiet space between those two choices, William found himself confronting something far deeper than politics. He was confronting legacy. Not just the legacy he would inherit, but the one he would leave behind. There were echoes in his mind, reminders of past fractures that had shaken the monarchy to its core. Moments where hesitation had allowed problems to grow, where silence had been mistaken for strength, only to unravel later in ways that could not be contained. He had seen what happened when difficult decisions were delayed, when personal ties were prioritized over institutional clarity. Those lessons were not abstract to him. They were lived, they were felt, and they lingered, shaping the way he viewed the situation now unfolding before him. At the same time, the absence of decisive leadership from above only intensified the pressure. King Charles, whether by choice or circumstance, remained distant in this critical moment, leaving a void that could not remain unfilled. And in that void, William felt the shift, not announced, not formalized, but undeniable. Responsibility was moving toward him, faster than expected, heavier than anticipated. The decision was no longer theoretical. It was his. For a brief moment, hesitation still lingered. Not because he lacked clarity, but because he understood the cost. This would not be a quiet correction. It would be a rupture. Relationships would strain. Trust would fracture. The consequences would not stay contained within palace walls, they would ripple outward, shaping perception, altering dynamics, redefining roles. And once set in motion, there would be no undoing it. But then, something within him settled. Not ease, not comfort, but resolve. The kind that comes not from certainty, but from acceptance. He understood that leadership, in its truest form, was not about avoiding conflict, it was about facing it when it mattered most. Protecting the monarchy was not just about preserving its image. It was about safeguarding its foundation, even when doing so meant making choices that felt deeply personal, even painful. The shift was subtle, but absolute. Hesitation gave way to decision. Doubt gave way to action. And in that moment, William stopped weighing possibilities and began defining outcomes. Whatever came next would carry consequences, but inaction was no longer one of them. The line had been crossed. The responsibility was clear. And the cost, no matter how heavy, would have to be paid. Because some decisions are not made in comfort, they are made in necessity. And once made, they change everything, not just for the moment, but for the future that follows. And as William made his choice, the palace braced for impact, because the fallout would not be quiet. It would be explosive. When the decree reached Camilla, the reaction was immediate and devastating. This wasn't just a political move. It was personal. Deeply personal. For the first time, the queen consort found herself not at the center of power, but on the receiving end of it. And what followed behind closed doors wasn't grace or acceptance, but raw emotion, disbelief, and a confrontation no one expected. The words of the decree did not feel like policy to her, they felt like a rupture, sharp and deliberate, cutting through years of carefully maintained position and quiet influence. For a brief moment there was silence, the kind that doesn't calm but tightens, as if the weight of what had just happened needed time to fully settle before it could even be processed. Then came the realization. Not gradual, not softened, but immediate. Everything connected to her family, the privileges, the recognition, the access, had been removed in a single motion. Not reduced. Not reconsidered. Removed. And in that realization, disbelief gave way to something far more volatile. This was not how power was supposed to work within the monarchy. Not like this. Not without warning. Not without her. The sense of betrayal rose quickly, and it was precise. It pointed directly at William. Not as a distant figure acting in duty, but as someone who had crossed an invisible line, one that separated authority from loyalty. There had always been tension, yes, but this felt different. This felt final. And in that moment, the question was no longer why he had done it, but how far he was willing to go next. Private exchanges began almost immediately, and they were anything but controlled. Words carried weight, but also emotion sharp, unfiltered, impossible to contain. What had once been managed behind careful diplomacy now surfaced with intensity, revealing fractures that had been hidden for far too long. There was anger, but also something deeper, a sense of displacement, of being pushed out of a space that had never been fully secure to begin with. Amid the rising tension, one absence became impossible to ignore. King Charles. Attempts were made to reach him, not just out of protocol, but out of urgency. This was not a moment that could be handled without him, and yet his voice remained distant, his position unclear. That silence did not calm the situation, it amplified it. It left questions unanswered, leaving Camilla to confront not just the decision itself, but the possibility that she was standing alone and facing it. The impact rippled outward quickly, reaching her family with equal force. Shock spread, followed by confusion, then fear. Their connection to the monarchy, once a source of stability, now felt like a vulnerability. The privileges they had come to rely on were gone, and with them a sense of protection that had never been questioned before. And as they struggled to understand what had happened, another realization began to take shape. This was not just a consequence. It was a message. But what made the moment even more dangerous was that it did not feel contained. It felt like the beginning of something larger, something that had not yet fully unfolded. The emotions inside the palace were not settling, they were building. Each reaction, each unanswered question, each unspoken accusation added to a growing tension that refused to dissipate. Because decisions like this do not exist in isolation. They create movement. They provoke response. And as the weight of what had just happened continued to press down, one thing became increasingly clear: this conflict was far from over. But while emotions erupted behind palace walls, outside those walls the world was already beginning to react. Within minutes, the story broke and the world lit up. Headlines. Speculation. Outrage. Support. Social media exploded as millions tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was this justice or a royal overreach? As the public weighed in, one thing became clear. This wasn't just a palace crisis anymore, it was a global spectacle. The speed of it was overwhelming, almost unnatural, as if the moment the decree was signed, it triggered something far beyond the control of the institution itself. News outlets didn't wait for confirmation, they reacted instantly, each one racing to define the narrative before anyone else could. Words like unprecedented, power shift, and royal purge began to circulate, each headline sharper than the last, each interpretation more intense than the one before it. But it wasn't just the media that fueled the fire, it was the public. Reactions came fast, emotional, and deeply divided. Some saw William's move as a bold act of leadership, a necessary correction that signaled strength and accountability in a system often accused of protecting its own. To them, this was long overdue, a moment where the future king chose duty over comfort, clarity over compromise. But others saw something entirely different. They questioned the suddenness, the lack of transparency, the absence of explanation. To them, it felt too aggressive, too calculated, too final. Not justice, but overreach. As the divide grew louder, royal commentators found themselves scrambling, trying to interpret a situation that had unfolded too quickly to fully understand. Analysts debated the implications, not just of the decision itself, but of what it revealed about the internal structure of the monarchy. Was this a controlled act of authority, or a sign of deeper instability? The lack of clarity only intensified the speculation, creating space for theories that stretched far beyond what could be confirmed. And then came the amplification. Social media turned reaction into momentum. Every opinion became a statement. Every statement became a trend. Clips, commentary, analysis, it all merged into a continuous wave of interpretation that moved faster than any official response could keep up with. Emotions drove the conversation, not facts. Loyalty clashed with skepticism. Support collided with doubt. And in the middle of it all, the original decision began to take on a life of its own, shaped as much by perception as by reality. Questions began to surface, serious ones. Not just about what had happened, but how it had happened. What authority had been used? What protocol had been followed or bypassed? Could a move like this truly be executed without broader approval? These weren't just technical concerns. They struck at the heart of how the monarchy functioned, how power was exercised, and who ultimately held it. Beyond national borders, the reaction only intensified. International observers watched closely, not just out of curiosity, but out of concern. The monarchy had always been a symbol of continuity, of stability. But now, that image felt uncertain. If decisions of this magnitude could be made so abruptly, what did that mean for the future? What did it suggest about the balance of power within the institution? And as the narrative expanded, evolving faster than anyone inside the palace could manage, one reality became impossible to ignore. The story was no longer theirs to control. It had moved beyond them, shaped by voices they could not silence, interpretations they could not contain, and reactions they could not predict. Because once the world starts watching, every silence becomes louder, every absence more noticeable. And in the middle of all this noise, one silence stood above the rest, not because it was small, but because it was deliberate. And as the world debated, one critical voice remained eerily quiet: the king himself. In the midst of chaos, one silence echoed louder than any statement King Charles said. Nothing. No confirmation. No denial. No intervention. Just silence. Was this calculated restraint, or a sign of deeper fracture within the crown? As speculation intensified, insiders began to question whether the king was truly in control, or if power had already begun to shift. The absence was not subtle. It was glaring. At a moment when clarity was desperately needed, when the institution itself seemed to tremble under the weight of a single decision, the voice expected to steady everything simply did not appear. And in that absence, uncertainty began to take shape, not slowly, but all at once. For those within the palace, this silence carried meaning. It suggested distance, either chosen or imposed, and neither possibility felt reassuring. If this had unfolded without the king's involvement, it raised a question too uncomfortable to ignore. How could a decision of this magnitude be executed without his direct authority? And if he had known, if he had allowed it to happen, then why remain silent now, when the world was demanding answers? Either way, the silence did not protect his position. It exposed it. Theories began to form quickly. filling the space left behind by the lack of explanation. Some believed this was a strategic withdrawal, a deliberate decision to let William act without interference, to test his authority in a moment of crisis. Others saw something far more troubling: a fracture between father and son, a divide that had remained hidden until now, suddenly revealed through action rather than words. And as these theories spread, they began to shape perception, turning uncertainty into narrative. The possibility that William had acted independently or even preemptively only deepened the tension. If true, it suggested a shift already in motion, one that had not been formally acknowledged, but was becoming impossible to deny. Power, in this context, was not just about title. It was about control, about who made decisions when it mattered most. And in this moment, that control appeared to be moving. Inside the palace, maintaining unity became increasingly difficult. Officials, bound by protocol and expectation, worked to present stability, but the strain beneath the surface was undeniable. Messages were measured, carefully constructed, yet lacking the authority that only a clear, singular voice could provide. Without that voice, cohesion felt fragile, almost performative, as if it could unravel at any moment. Beyond the palace walls, the silence was interpreted in ways that could not be controlled. Some saw it as weakness, a hesitation that suggested uncertainty at the highest level. Others viewed it as calculation, a deliberate choice to avoid escalation. But what mattered most was not which interpretation was correct, it was that both existed, simultaneously, creating a narrative that shifted depending on who was watching. And as that narrative continued to evolve, one realization began to take hold. This was not just a moment of crisis, it was a moment of transition. Not declared, not formalized, but felt. The kind of shift that does not announce itself, but reveals itself through action, through absence, through the quiet reordering of authority. Because power does not always move with noise. Sometimes, it moves in silence. And when that silence becomes louder than any command, it signals something far more significant than a single decision. It signals change. The kind that reshapes everything that follows, and if this was indeed a shift in power, then what comes next may be even more dramatic. The decree was only the beginning. What followed would ripple through every corner of the monarchy, reshaping alliances, redefining loyalty, and leaving scars that may never fully heal. This wasn't just about one family losing privilege. It was about the future of the crown itself. And as the dust began to settle, one truth became impossible to ignore. Nothing would ever be the same again. The immediate aftermath did not arrive with clarity, it arrived with disruption. Structures that had once felt immovable began to shift, not dramatically at first, but enough to be felt by those who understood how the institution truly functioned. Roles were quietly reassessed, responsibilities were reconsidered. Lines that had blurred over time were suddenly redrawn, sharper than before, leaving little room for interpretation. What made this moment so significant was not just what had been taken away, but what it revealed. Authority, once perceived as distributed, now appeared concentrated. The monarchy, long associated with continuity and careful evolution, had stepped into something far more assertive, and at the center of that shift stood William, not as a future figure, but as a present force. His influence, once subtle, had become unmistakable. This was no longer preparation. This was action. For Camilla, the consequences extended beyond the immediate loss. Her position, while still intact, began to feel different, less secure, less defined. Influence that had once operated quietly now faced visible limits. And with those limits came a new reality. The balance she had maintained within the royal structure was no longer stable. It was being recalibrated, not through negotiation, but through decision. And that recalibration carried emotional weight, not just for her, but for everyone connected to her. Within the family, the fractures that had long been managed began to surface more openly. Tension that had once been contained through silence now lingered in every interaction, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Trust, once assumed, now felt conditional. Loyalty, once clear, now seemed uncertain. The emotional cost of the decision became evident not through public statements, but through the subtle distance that began to form between those who had once stood closer. At the same time, the public response continued to evolve, no longer focused solely on the decision itself, but on what it represented. Trust in the monarchy was being tested in ways that could not be easily repaired. Some saw strength in the decisiveness, a willingness to act where others might hesitate. Others saw instability, a sign that the institution was no longer as controlled as it appeared. And between those perspectives, the narrative of the monarchy began to change. This was the beginning of something new. Not just a shift in structure, but a shift in identity. The monarchy was no longer operating solely on tradition, it was adapting, responding, asserting itself in ways that felt unfamiliar yet undeniable. And as that transformation unfolded, it became clear that this moment would not fade into the past. It would define what came next. Because decisions like this do not simply resolve conflict. They reshape it. They set new expectations, create new tensions, and open paths that were previously unthinkable. And as the monarchy adjusted to this new reality, one question began to take hold, growing louder with each passing moment. But even as the monarchy begins to adapt, one question remains: was this the end of a conflict? Or just the beginning of something far more dangerous? This wasn't just a moment, it was a warning. A glimpse into the kind of King William may become. Decisive, uncompromising, unafraid to act even when the cost is personal. But if this is how he leads now, what happens when he holds the crown? As tensions linger and alliances shift, the monarchy stands on the edge of a new era, one that may be defined not by tradition, but by transformation. The decision that once felt shocking now begins to settle into something far more significant, a signal. Not just of what has happened, but of what is coming. Because leadership reveals itself most clearly in moments of pressure, and in this moment, William did not hesitate. He acted. Fully. Irreversibly. And in doing so, he offered a preview of a future that feels both controlled and unpredictable at the same time. What stands out is not just the boldness of the action, but the clarity behind it. There was no attempt to soften the impact, no effort to delay consequences. It was direct, calculated, and absolute. That kind of leadership does not emerge suddenly, it is built, shaped over time, waiting for the moment when it can no longer remain restrained. And now that it has surfaced, it cannot simply retreat back into quiet observation. It changes expectations. It redefines what people believe William is capable of, not someday but now. Naturally, this has sparked a new wave of speculation. If this is how he responds to internal conflict, what happens when the challenges grow larger, more public, more complex? Will this same decisiveness become the foundation of his reign, or will it create tensions that the monarchy has never had to navigate before? Because strength, when applied without compromise, can stabilize, but it can also divide. And that balance is now more fragile than ever. Within the royal circle, those tensions have not disappeared. They have simply shifted. Conversations have changed. Alliances feel less certain. There is an awareness now, quiet but persistent, that the dynamics within the monarchy are evolving faster than anyone anticipated. And at the center of that evolution remains a question that no one can fully answer: where does this leave Camilla? Her position, once steady, now exists in a space of uncertainty. Not removed, not replaced, but undeniably altered. And in that uncertainty lies the potential for further conflict, further decisions that may push the boundaries even further. Outside the palace, anticipation continues to build. The public is no longer just reacting, they are watching, waiting, trying to understand what comes next. Some feel confidence, believing that strong leadership will bring clarity to an institution that has often struggled with perception. Others feel unease, sensing that the pace of change may come with consequences that are not yet visible. And between those reactions lies a tension that mirrors what is happening inside the monarchy itself. Because this is no longer just about a single decision. It is about direction, about momentum, about a future that feels less predictable than it once did. The monarchy is entering a phase where tradition alone may not be enough to guide it, where decisions will shape not just its image, but its identity. And in that space of uncertainty, one truth becomes impossible to ignore: this story is not over. Not even close. There are still layers that have not been revealed, tensions that have not fully surfaced, and choices that have yet to be made. What we have seen so far may only be the beginning of something far more complex, far more consequential. Because in the world of royalty, power is never truly settled, and the next move may already be unfolding behind closed doors. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.